everybody, welcome to what is sadly going to be a wrap up of some quite mediocre books that I read in December. It has been the longest time since I've had a 5-star, guys. I didn't even realize there is one 5-star in this video, but it is a reread of like my favorite book of all time, so it was obviously going to be 5. But in terms of new books, I haven't had a 5-star since October, and I'm hoping that 2024 is going to be changing that for me. But in December, reading went okay. I read a couple of really thick books, so I only got through like 7 books in total. In terms of the page count, wasn't the highest, knew it wasn't going to be, so that was fine. But I think overall it is still like a pretty substantial wrap up, considering my main goal of December was not reading. But getting into the statistics for the books that I read in December, I did read 7 books in total, adding up to a total of 3,777 pages, which broke down to an average of 122 pages per day. For the star ratings, I had 4 3-stars. I did enjoy pretty much everything that I read in December, it's just there weren't really many standouts. I had 2 4-star reads and 1 5, which was that reread, breaking down to an average of 3.57 per book. For the demographics, I read 1 young adult book, 1 new adult, and 5 adult. For the formats, I read 5 standardly formatted novels and I listened to 2 audiobooks. For the genres, we had 3 fantasy romance, 2 fantasy, 1 historical, and 1 romance. And finally, for the places where I sourced these books from, 5 of them were from my own TBR that existed prior to the start of 2023, and 2 of them are books that I had hauled in 2023. So getting straight into my thoughts, this one's going to be a rough one because my first book of the month was also my first 3-star, and that was The Book Thief by Marcus Zusak. I just did not love this one as I expected to. I did not have like the transcendent experience that I expected when I was reading this book, just based on how many people love this book and how much they love it. So this one is a World War II story. It's set over, I think it's about a 5-year period during World War II, like starting slightly before the war started and going, I guess, like into the height of it. But we're following a German girl called Liesel who is given into foster care, and she has these like adoptive foster parents that take care of her because her mother no longer can. Now, this book is structured in the books that the book thief steals, and having no knowledge of this book going into it, I thought that this was almost a fantastical story about this little girl that was running around Europe in the 1940s, stopping the Nazis from burning books by like literally stealing them before they could get there. And that's not what this story is. It is very historical fiction, which is fine because that's the genre it is. I just typically don't like historical fiction. It is almost slice of life as well. It's narrated by Death, but it breaks down into like these little stories of minor moments in the characters' lives. Like Liesel has a friend and it'll like tell her,
I found this on the web for little stories of mine. Check it out.
But it'll go into this story of like something that happened to this boy one summer, and it'll like keep cutting away to little points like that. It also like tells you the end before you get to the middle point of the story, assumedly, so that you're drawing factors like wondering how we get to this end point. But I felt like the journey was very almost slice of life, and I just always thought, I always assumed that it had a little bit of a wider plot than that. Like I thought that the character of Liesel was more pivotal in the war, where this is actually more of a picture of a young German girl at the time that like the war was happening. As somebody who doesn't love historical fiction, I didn't love this book. I was quite bored throughout the middle because it's just typically not the kind of story that I would ever reach for. And the only reason why I actually own this is because, one, it was gifted to me many years ago, but also because of how much everybody loves it. I thought, I don't know, I just thought I was going to have some like transcendent experience during this book that never really happened. So sadly it was a 3-star for me. It is of course emotional just because of the subject matter, and so I did cry a little bit at the end of this, but just like overall my experience while reading this was not particularly enjoyable. I then picked up a book. This is probably, is this my favorite book of the month? Maybe. It's tied with my other 4-star for sure, which makes sense obviously if we don't count the reread that was a 5-star, but that was Lord of Chaos by Robert Jordan. So this one is book 6 in the Wheel of Time series, and if you know anything about the Wheel of Time, you will know that even the fans of this series will tell you that the pace of it can be quite slow. So the plot is that we're following this boy called Rand, who is the Dragon Reborn, which is a pivotal figure in this like epic battle that has been happening over ages. So in this particular age, he is the Dragon Reborn, and and it's not a fate that like he ever knew about. He grew up on a farm, like he was just a farm boy in this very quiet town, and he's kind of been thrust into the midst of this conflict, being told that like he is the one that is potentially going to like either save or break them all. So we are following some supporting side characters as well that have the ability to alter the weave of time and kind of change the events of the ages. In the telling of the story, it is quite slow. Like Robert Jordan likes to focus on the details, he likes to focus on small moments. I find the telling of this story not to be especially compelling, but I find the plotting to be very good, and the more you read, the more evident it is that this is like a large scale plan that Robert Jordan has always known, and he's taken a lot of time to tell the story, but the quality of the story is potentially very, very good. Wheel of Time fans, like hardcore fans of the series, will say there are slow points, there are tedious points throughout this series, and from what I believe or believed, a lot of people think that the roughest part of this series is between books 6 and 10. A lot of people say that like book 10 is the worst. A lot of people say it only slows down around book 7, but some people believe that this is kind of like the turning point where the series becomes less interesting for some people. So I was prepared for that. I haven't had the best time with this series because, like I said, I don't think Robert Jordan's writing style, the telling of his story, is particularly engaging, while I do like the story itself. So I was prepared for that going into this, and this actually turned out to be my favorite book in the series. And thinking about it, I do typically enjoy slower books in series. Like the books in series that everybody doesn't like the second Grishaverse book, is my favorite book of the series. So I'm actually now looking forward to the slump era of Wheel of Time, because I feel like it could be the time where I actually get really invested in the series. I feel like this book had a lot of moments that shocked me, and that was another reason why I enjoyed it so much. With me not loving Robert Jordan's slow pacing, the way that he tells stories, I find that these shocking moments feel like they come out of nowhere because I'm lulled into this almost like drowsy state as I'm listening to the audiobook, and then out of nowhere this like big pivotal thing happens. I still have a lot of issues with like the general enjoyment of the series, but I feel like I'm a lot more invested in the characters and the plot, to the point where like I care about some of these really pivotal moments. So this was a great reading experience for me, and I'm really excited to get into book 7. The good thing about books 7 to 10 as well is they are a little bit smaller. Like this one was nearly 1,000 pages, which is why when I said like I haven't read a ton of books, I've still read a lot, because this on its own is like 993 pages. But going forward up to book 10, I think that they are like considerably smaller than 1,000 pages, which is great. My next 3-star was The Wrath and the Dawn by Renee Ahdieh, but I do feel like this is more of a case of me not being in the right headspace to read this book more than the book itself. So I believe that this is a 1001 Nights retelling, and we are following a young woman called Shahzad who has volunteered to become the king's next bride. Now he is currently taking a bride every single night or every single day, and then the morning after, as the sun rises, she is being executed. And one of these executed brides is actually Shahzad's best friend. So she volunteers to become the next queen or like bride of the king, so that she can get close to him and actually kill him in revenge for all of the lives that he's taken. So part of Shahzad's tactic is to buy more time for herself. So on the first night after her marriage, the king comes to her rooms and she starts to tell him a story, and as the sun rises, she withholds the end of the story so that he has to let her live another day for her to continue. I really enjoyed the atmosphere and the setting of this. The story is quite isolated, and I do wish like the scope of it was a little bigger. This book does take place pretty much exclusively in the palace, and there's periods of times where like Khalid goes away for like days or a couple of weeks, and it almost just like skips that time and jumps back to like when he's returning and carries on like the story of Shahzad and Khalid. And I just feel like I would have been slightly more invested in this if the scope of the plot was a little bit wider. But I do feel like my issue with this, I feel like this could have very easily been more enjoyable and a 4-star read for me had I just not read it so disjointedly, because at the time that I was reading it in stops and starts. Like I was reading a chapter here or there, which really interrupted the flow of this one for me. But I did by the end find that I was like really invested in the romance. It was an easy read. It was pretty quick when I was actually reading it. I just needed to sit down and focus and dedicate a little bit more time to be fully absorbed. So like I feel like I did this book a disservice more than anything. But I did pick up the ebook of the sequel, which I'm hoping to get to sometime soon, because it is only a duology, and I enjoyed this one enough to want to finish it out. I then did finally get to A Christmas Romance. Ideally, I would have read more just because like I own them and there's only like a small period of the year where I can actually read them, but I only had time to read one, which was The Holiday Swap by Maggie Knox. I really enjoyed this one because it centers around baking. We're following twin sisters who grew up like essentially in a bakery, and one of the sisters still lives in the town, like the town where they grew up, and runs the family bakery, and the other one is a judge on like an LA equivalent of the Great British Bake Off, where they're currently filming a 12 Days to Christmas special. One day when they're filming, Charlie gets into an accident which gives her concussion, and she can no longer smell or taste anything, which obviously is a problem when she's filming this competition. So she convinces Cass to swap places with her so that she can lie low and run the family bakery in this time until her sense of taste and smell come back. Cass agrees because she's currently going through a breakup and she wants to be as far away from her ex as possible. It's kind of like it's a simple breakup in terms of like it's just gone on too long and she's the one who ended it, but she just kind of doesn't want to have to deal with seeing her ex all of the time. So she's happy to go to LA, and then during the course of this swap, they grow close to people like kind of in their sisters' lives. So this one was very Hallmark movie, which is to be expected, and one of the reasons why I don't typically feel drawn to Christmas romances is because I feel like a book is too long for me to be absorbed in those vibes. Like the length of a Hallmark movie is perfect, but to read a book will take me a couple of days, and that's too long for me to live in that like Hallmark vibe space, you know? This one I did actually really enjoy for the most part. I would say the first like 200 pages or so, just checking how long this one is. Yeah, so for the first 2/3 of this book, as the sisters were kind of like in the main swap portion, I really enjoyed it because I do really like books about food and baking especially. So I loved that element, and I also loved the atmosphere of the like cute, quaint little wintry American town that the sisters were from. But towards the end, it did get a little bit cheesy and a little bit too twee for me. So I ended up giving this one a 3-star overall. I feel like for the Christmas vibes, it was good. But as I expected from this, like it wasn't anything that particularly stood out to me, but it definitely provided like that festive atmosphere, which is its main purpose really. I then read my Patreon book club book, which was Deadlands by Stacey Marie Brown. This one is the third book in the Savage Land series, which is this like almost post-apocalyptic fantasy romance series that's set in like an alternate history or like futuristic version of Budapest. The catalyst for the change in this world was that the veil between the lands of the humans and the Fae fell about 20 years prior to the start of this story, and that resulted in a war that caused the city of Budapest to be split, with the Fae living in one half of the city and the humans living in the other. Our main character Brexley is the daughter of a general that died shortly after these wars, and she is now the ward of the king. So to give back from her position of privilege, she steals drugs and other goods from the trains that transport them from the Fae to the human sides of the world, and like vice versa, and she puts them onto the black market so that the money goes into the pockets of the people who need it, like the lower classes, instead of just lining the pockets of the elite. One day when she's doing this, she's caught at the Fae checkpoint and thrown into a maximum security prison, where she kind of starts to figure out that the people that brought her up, like the human side of this conflict that she's always been on, may not necessarily be the right one. This series is complete like no thoughts, head empty for me when I'm reading it. Every problem that the main character has ever had is solved by an explosion, and I'm like currently, as I'm filming this, I'm over halfway through book 4 and that still remains to be the same. The romance in here did really ramp up in this one though, so if that's what you were reading it for, like this is the book where things are gonna start to get real good for you. I personally didn't love the spicy scenes in here. I feel like I very much flip-flop between really enjoying the sexual tension between the main character and the love interest, and also like interactions in this series as a whole in general just really giving me the ick. I did struggle a lot with that in this one because there was so much more sexual content. It's just like comments that side characters make, and like the main character has this like raw sexual energy that draws everyone around her to her, and sex magic is just typically not my thing. I've read it in other things and I don't enjoy it, but there's just something about this series that is so addictive. So even though the execution like isn't amazing, I have a really good time with this one, even though I know like it isn't anything groundbreaking, so this one was another 3-star for me. I then read my other 4-star read, which is tied for my favorite book of December, and that was Under the Whispering Door by TJ Klune. So TJ Klune's books need a warning on them that like lets you know that you are probably gonna cry. And I definitely cried through at the end of this, even though my main criticism of this one is that I feel like TJ Klune really pulled his punch with this book. But this one is following a guy called Wallace who is a lawyer. He's not very empathetic. He is conventionally successful, but he has nobody who cares about him, which becomes very evident when he dies suddenly of a heart attack. And when he's attending his own funeral, the only people that are there are his ex-wife, who absolutely rips into him during the eulogy, and the 3 other partners of his law firm. So he is then taken by a reaper to see the ferryman, which is Hugo, who runs a tea shop, and Wallace has to stay there until he kind of comes to terms with his death and decides that he wants to cross over. And Hugo's job is to help people, like recently deceased people, do that, like help them cross over. The tea shop that Hugo runs is a regular tea shop that caters to regular humans, but there are a couple of ghosts hanging around. There's Hugo's grandfather, who's like pretty much a permanent resident. There's also Hugo's dog, and then Wallace himself turns up. So this is, as well as like a fantastical story about things like acceptance, personal growth, the meaning of life. It is also a queer romance. TJ Klune has this like talent of writing emotional stories that are also humorous, which I really enjoy. And he does have a recurring theme of characters that are like really devoted to their work, and so devoted to their work that they have nothing else in their life, kind of breaking out of the status quo and learning to live again. And this definitely was not an exception. I did really enjoy it for the most part. It was exactly kind of what I expected from this story. I did give House in the Cerulean Sea by TJ Klune 5 stars, and I did enjoy this one slightly less. One reason is because the scope of the plot is just a little bit smaller. It's a very isolated setting. Pretty much the entirety of this book does take place in the tea room, and the only real goal, like we have side characters that have their own kind of mini plots going on that Wallace and Hugo like have a hand in solving throughout the course of the book, but the main goal of the book is getting Wallace to cross over, like getting him to a place where he has accepted his death and his life and is ready to move on. And it all happens like in the tea room, where I feel like the House in the Cerulean Sea has a slightly like wider scope of plot to keep things a little bit more exciting. And then the other like minor thing is that I do feel like TJ Klune pulled his punch with this one. I feel like given the themes and Hugo's purpose in this book, the book should have ended a certain way. And I feel like TJ Klune really took the safe choice with that, whereas the hard choice I feel would have been especially poignant and really highlighted some of the messages of this book. That being said, I still cried like a baby at the end, so fair warning. And also fair warnings or content warnings for suicide, self-harm, panic attacks, and just like general grief obviously is a central theme of this book as well. And then my final read was House of Earth and Blood by Sarah J Maas. I'm currently rereading this series, ready for the 3rd book being released at the end of January, even though I'm actually only going to be able to get to it at the end of February, which is kind of painful. But this one is an urban fantasy book. It is Sarah J Maas's technically first adult book, and it is following a half-fae woman called Bryce Quinlan, who is tasked with investigating a series of murders by the Archangel of Crescent City, because she has assumedly like a personal tie to these murders. 2 years before the bulk of this story, the government had assumed that they'd put this murderer behind bars, but bodies are now turning up again all over the city. So Bryce is recruited to look into it using her personal connection to maybe get to the bottom of what's going on. And because this is so dangerous, she is assigned a personal bodyguard in the form of the fallen angel Hunt Athalar. I adore this book. This is the 3rd time I've read it, and it still hits every single time. I cried like a baby throughout the last 200 pages of this again, because this book has it all, in my opinion. Some people think it has a slow start and that it's a lot of info dumping. That is definitely valid, but the main themes in this book I would say are like guilt and trauma and grief and friendship, and I just really love the way that this book makes me feel all of the emotions, considering it's just one book as well. Like I feel like I generally need to be deeper into a series to feel as attached to these characters as I do the Crescent City characters. It also has themes of found family. I love the sibling relationship that is in this book. It's potentially my favorite. Rune is probably my favorite character as well, but Bryce is my favorite Sarah J Maas heroine. I love her strength and like her heart and her like the depth of her love and just her loyalty. She is such a loyal character, which really appeals to me. The slow growth of the relationships in this book I adore. And then in terms of it being a fantasy, like it keeps me, I can't speak for you, but it keeps me intrigued and interested the entire way through, even through those slow parts. And the end of this, like the action portion of this book, is so cinematic and just so many points of high emotion. So I will always sing this book's praises, even though I'm not necessarily a massive fan of the series as a whole, or I can only say books 2 at this point. I do still adore these characters, and these are my favorite like Sarah J Maas characters, my favorite Sarah J Maas world, and that's coming from somebody who's like a pretty big fan. And for this reread in particular, I actually listened to the audiobook, which I loved, and I was shocked about it because I listened to the audiobook essentially so I could like do a jigsaw and like some craft projects while I was listening, because I knew I didn't have to pay so much attention with this being my third read. And I have actually tried to listen to a Throne of Glass audiobook in the past, and the pronunciation being different to how I pronounce things was really frustrating me. So I gave up, and all of Sarah J Maas's books are narrated by Elizabeth Evans, so I really thought I wasn't going to like this, but I feel like Elizabeth Evans does such a good job narrating this book that I had an amazing time listening to the audiobook. And it was also really great to enjoy a story that I love through a slightly different medium this time. So 5 stars. Still my favorite book ever. So those are all of the books that I read in December. I am kind of upset about how kind of mediocre I was feeling about the books that I read in December. There were a couple of decent ones in there, but I feel like I'm just thirsting for a 5-star at this point. It's been a long time since I've become obsessed with something new. So going into 2024, that is definitely something that I'm looking for, and I want to prioritize the books that I'm really excited about over anything else really in the coming year. But down in the comments, let me know what your final book of the year was. Like, what was the last book you finished in December, and was it good? Like, was it a 5-star or was it disappointing to you? But aside from that, guys, please don't forget to like this video if you liked it, and subscribe if you want to. If you head into my description box, you'll find a link to my Goodreads, Instagram and Twitter if you'd like to follow me on any of those, as well as a link to my Bookish Candle website, the Etsy for that, and a 10% off discount code. But that's it from me today, guys. Bye!
Oh, you bite your friend like chocolate. You say you'll go where nobody knows, with guns hidden under our petticoats. We're never gonna quit it, no, we're never gonna quit it, no.